Whoops, don't mind me dropping a video about all the games I played in 2022, 2 months into 2023. Just like previous years, I played a mix of both new games as well as catching up on my backlog. Here's my spoiler-free thoughts on every game I played in 2022. Going into 2022, the Somnium Files nirvanA initiative was easily my most anticipated game of that year. As a sequel to one of my favorite visual novels ever made, and another work from my favorite writer, Kotaro Uchikoshi, did it deliver? Yes. Sort of. Mostly. While nirvanA initiative isn't as strong as its predecessor, and honestly it might just be my second least favorite Uchikoshi game, it's still a solid murder mystery filled with lovable characters fit with Uchikoshi's brand of batshit random humor. On top of improved gameplay and presentation, nirvanA initiative tackles ambitious topics and narrative ideas. While not all of its execution is stellar, with the story trying to bite off more than it can chew, in particular with its dual protagonists, it remains an intriguing and subversive ride from start to finish, fit with a classic bonkers Uchikoshi twist that, while admittedly has one glaring issue, managed to enhance and tie together everything that came before narratively and especially thematically in stunning fashion. And in the end, that's what I really respect about this game and the works of Uchikoshi in general. He's always trying to push the boundaries of how video games as a medium can convey their stories. He always presents the player a balance between the earnesty of his characters and humor, contrasted with challenging the player on how to piece together his stories. So even if not everything worked for me personally, the Somnium Files nirvanA initiative is a miracle in storytelling, and a ride that I soon won't forget. So we flip-flop from a game that I was most hyped for to a game I knew nothing about. Buried Stars has 5 idols and a producer awaiting rescue after the stage of the reality TV show they were competing on suddenly collapses. What starts out as a simple wait and rescue quickly devolves into a mystery of the corpse of their producer appearing, and someone on social media impersonating her, while threatening to divulge each character's deepest secrets. Tension is easily Buried Stars' greatest strength. The combination of the crumbling venue, the corpse, and the excessive gossip on social media about the characters feeds into everyone's spiraling mentality. They become more irritable and eventually hostile. Schisms and suspicions between characters develop the more they try to unravel the truth of the entire situation. It creates both a physical and mental claustrophobic atmosphere. I was pleasantly surprised how much I came to love the cast. It doesn't take long before the game starts diving into each character's backgrounds, peeling back their layers as more information about them begins to be uncovered. Each character is broken, having deep insecurities and flaws that weigh heavily on their minds. But ultimately, it's something they had to cast aside every time they enter the stage. The name and premise of the game directly ties thematically into the idea for the story and characters. They all had to bury a past part of themselves to participate in this show, but all of that literally comes crumbling down, as the cast is forced to reveal who they are underneath the rubble. There's only one gripe I have with the game, and that's the discussion portions dragging on for a bit too long, with an overwhelming amount of information to consult through with each character. That being said, with its wonderful visual style, slick menus, and strong soundtrack, on top of its strong story and characters, Buried Stars is a gripping mystery that kept me engaged from start to finish. The Caligula Effect 2 is the epitome of gaming comfort food. It's written by the same person who wrote Persona 1 and 2, which are considered by some to be some of the greatest video game stories of all time. So does the Caligula Effect 2 live up to that pedigree? No, not even close. But it doesn't need to be. Where the game lacks in complex writing and polished gameplay, it shines with its vibes and a heart of gold that it earnestly wears on its sleeve. Going through this game just made me so happy. The story and its themes has the nuance and subtlety as throwing a brick at someone, but I feel that's part of its charm. There's so much soul into conveying its messages that I didn't really care about any of its shortcomings. With the gist of the series being people getting unknowingly trapped in a pocket dimension to escape some sort of regret they feel in reality, it creates a unique and interesting set of main characters once they find out about the false world they inhabit. Their personalities might fall into common archetypes, but delving into their personal issues and regrets they faced in the real world gives context to why these characters behave the way they do, why a part of them clings to living the way they wanted to live in this false world. The premise is used in great effect to demonstrate a wide range of personal conflicts that you just don't see very often in this kind of setting, subverting or straight up disregarding a lot of the tropes that comes from a typical high school main cast. The game is just really funny too. There were so many moments that had me laughing out loud by some of the ridiculous things the characters would say, most of which come from the mascot character Key. She's a gremlin who has one singular brain cell, and I love her. So in short, if you're willing to put up with mediocre gameplay, stilted visuals, and a story that isn't anything to write home about, what you'll find is that the Caligula Effect 2 is a game that proudly presents its personal story, characters, and themes with so much heart and soul. It contains a desire to dive into unconventional topics that might not fully resonate with everyone, but it does so with so much love and care that you just can't help but be enthralled by the sincerity of it all. The Science Adventure series, or SciADV for short, contains both thoughtful and powerful narratives. Chaos Child and Steins Gate in particular are my two favorite video game stories of all time. While each entry is standalone, they all take place in the same shared universe and contribute to a building conflict. However, the first in the series, Chaos Head from 2006, never released outside of Japan, despite kicking off the overarching narrative and possessing relevant plot details to subsequent titles. But finally, in 2022, a localization of the expanded version of the game titled Chaos Head Noah released, and it's pretty good. While some of the translation can be extremely stiff, and it does show its age with that first entry throwing things at the wall to see what sticks vibe, it's interesting to see how Chaos Head serves as a blueprint for the rest of the series. SciADV stories are incredibly grim, slow burn character studies of extremely flawed protagonists. The premise and conflicts of each title serving as a backdrop to observe how these characters respond to their different situations. Chaos Head kicks the series' streak of extremely flawed protagonists with Takumi Nishijo, a perverted high school otaku who spends his days as a shut-in, minimizing the amount of time he goes outside to the point he puts effort into scheduling his school days around how much he can avoid showing up and still graduating. So in short, he's pretty cringe. While admittedly his character trope is played too far sometimes, looking past a lot of Takumi's surface-level characterizations means you're up for witnessing a thoughtfully written, sometimes infuriating growth of this character, in a good way. Chaos Head's murder mystery is expertly utilized to have him grow or regress in the way that always makes sense within the context of the story, as the danger and his involvement with the serial murder case gets closer and closer. Takumi's anxiety worsens, and the tension is strongly conveyed to the player. Even at the start, Chaos Head has this unnerving atmosphere, almost as if something is constantly off. The uncomfortable vibe grows to something more oppressive as Takumi's mental state deteriorates, compounded with how twisted and gory some of these murders can be. It's a rare example of something being scarier the more exposure the player has to it. Small habits he performs grows into something downright terrifying, even if rationally it shouldn't be anything scary. The other characters are mostly solid, both on their own as characters and as people Takumi questions on whether or not he can trust. It's not perfect. Some characters could have been fleshed out more, and the latter half, while solid, isn't as strong as the first. And per SciADV tradition, grinding out character roots to reach the true ending is a slog without a guide. But ultimately, I loved my time with Chaos Head Noah. It's an engrossing and horror-filled start to one of my favorite series of all time.
Ground's too unstable to land a ship, you'll need to jump.
That's our cue. Let's go, Groot.
While I'm not really big into comics or the MCU anymore, I do have a soft spot for the first two Guardians of the Galaxy films. So when I heard all the positive chatter for the game in 2021, especially to many how the story and characters were actually better than the movies, I was instantly intrigued. 20 hours later, and yeah, it's pretty good. Nothing mind-blowing from a gameplay or narrative standpoint, but still a solid time. Despite still preferring the flicks, I do think the general moment-to-moment writing of the characters actually exceeds their cinematic counterparts, even if the arcs they go through aren't as interesting or in-depth. These versions are much more grounded and nuanced in how they behave. A large part of that has to do with the game being much longer than both movies combined, allowing more instances to see them argue with one another, projecting their flaws and insecurity in an attempt to hide them, but also a chance for smaller, more intimate scenes, having the Guardians just talk and open up to each other, It makes them getting close and becoming a team feel much more earned, a strong sense of comfort for these characters to put aside their fears to help lift each other up. Even outside the missions where the main narrative progresses, the ship they travel on in their downtime feels like such a cozy place to call home. To see these characters go about doing their business, talking, arguing, laughing with one another, even the goddamn fridge that refuses to shut is something that feels at home. There's so much joy and passion put into this game that even if my time with it was just alright, it's one I'm glad I got to experience and look fondly back on.
Ready? Galaxy Brain, activate!
Oh hey, can't believe this music album came with a free video game. Overused jokes aside, the first World Ends With You took me years to play through. I enjoyed the characters and story of trying to escape a death game to get another chance at life, but it felt a bit too basic for me. And the touchscreen gameplay on the Switch version to mimic the DS, let's just say, was not exactly the most ideal experience, and the motion control options weren't great as well. But what the game didn't lack was its standout art direction, soundtrack, and vibes. Neo The World Ends With You comes around 14 years after the first game initially came out, and not only retains and evolves the style prevalent in the first game for modern audiences, it also brings shakeups and improvements in both gameplay and storytelling. The battle system this time around is handled via the control stick for movement and buttons for attacks, which makes combat less arthritis-inducing. Good lord, the music. But it's the story and characters that really drew me in. Despite its slow start, Neo presents interesting and fleshed out characters that believably grow and change through the course of the game. And I love Rindo's subdued personality in comparison to other JRPG's bombastic protagonists. It makes his more subtle arc hit much more effectively. I teared up multiple times through this game, and makes me wonder how hard some scenes would have hit for those who had waited over a decade for it. Sure, there's some characters who don't get much time to shine, and the long length and repetitiveness of the gameplay do damper some of the pacing, but I had a great time playing through Neo The World Ends With You, and I just really hope it doesn't take another 14 years for the next follow-up. And oh yeah, the music goddamn rocks! Pokemon is a series is one that I have really mixed thoughts on nowadays. I still enjoy every new entry that comes out, but it's a double-edged sword of releasing the same game for over 25 years. Each new entry brings the question of whether they'll bring something substantial to the table, or just be more of the same as something I may have enjoyed more in the past. While I loved Sword and Shield and felt it was a small step in the right direction for the series, it was sort of the one that made me fall out of love for the franchise. There's only so many small steps they can take with each new entry before you have to wonder, are we really getting anywhere? In comes Pokemon Legends Arceus, and this is the breath of fresh air the series needed. Tweaks to the battle system, the focus on catching Pokemon, and traversal through the open zones. These minor to medium changes culminate into creating something that feels familiar to the Pokemon formula, but fresh at the same time. The world of Legends, while admittedly a bit empty, is the glue that holds the gameplay experience together. Time progression of unlocking main quests to catching Pokemon means learning and taking advantage of the terrain, sneaking around a handful of other Pokemon to line up the best shot to throw the Pokeball at the one you want. And if a particularly aggressive one spots you, it's a mad dash through the world to try and escape so they don't annihilate you on the spot. That's right, Pokemon will straight up try to murder you, and it's great. It's an addicting loop of roaming around the world catching Pokemon, sometimes fighting them if you want, engaging in the occasional trainer battle here and there, and all in all, just getting lost in the wonderful world filled with charming characters. I sank 30 hours in just the first 2 areas alone, before I had to lock myself into finishing the last few, just so I can actually beat the damn game. It took the rough concept of Sword and Shield's wild area, and turned it into something that brought me so much awe and wonder that I hadn't felt in the series in such a long time. If this was such a strong attempt to have open areas, then surely their next attempt will knock it out of the park, right? Right? I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. The first few hours of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are probably some of the most miserable experiences I've had in a Pokemon game. The early story segments were a drag, The tutorials being mandatory, the speed of movement in battles, on top of certain quality of life features being removed, felt like such a step back from Sword and Shield. When the first open area was introduced and was just a flat plane, it was like, this is the next evolution in Pokemon? A downgrade from Legends Arceus, which came out that same exact year? And then after that, ooh boy, after that, it got better. A lot better, actually. Scarlet and Violet's strengths shine through the more time you put into it. The interweaving between 3 different storylines of the Gym Challenge, Evil Team, and Titan Pokemon feels seamless in the way you can tackle each objective in any order you please. As more movement options are unlocked, Paldea opens up so much more, and getting to each story quest becomes just as much fun as completing the quest itself. It's for that reason, while a bit of a bummer it not being the case, I didn't mind the levels not being scaled. Some of the most fun in Pokemon I've had in years was stumbling into a higher level area by accident and trying my best not to get overwhelmed by the strong Pokemon and trainers around me. The story was also another one of the highlights. It takes a while to get going, but the 3 different stories contain lovable and memorable characters, and surprisingly touches at the heartstrings on multiple occasions. It all culminates to easily the best final area in Pokemon, and one of the best finales in the series, tying together the message of the game and to an extent the entire series is about. No lie, I got a bit misty-eyed at its very conclusion. In the end, were all my initial concerns and gripes washed away? No, not all of them. The speed of the game, while not Diamond and Pearl levels of bad, is still excruciatingly slow. The lack of interiors is a bummer, and technical issues are everywhere. But ultimately, I stopped caring about those shortcomings. I had an absolute blast with Scarlet and Violet, and combined with Legends Arceus, I am excited for the future of Pokemon for the first time in a long time. Root Double Before Crime, what the hell is this name? This game was almost a home run with me. The sci-fi story and mystery is compelling, filled with twists and turns. All of the characters were surprisingly lovable and nuanced, and the icing on the cake is that it was written by Soki Tsukishima. Yeah, I think I butchered that. Someone who worked alongside Uchikoshi to deliver the Infinity series. So the concept and claustrophobic Zero-Escape-like atmosphere of being trapped in a slowly crumbling facility, ripe with characters spouting out random physics and conspiracy theories, is already up my alley. However, this aspect in particular is also my biggest gripe with the game. Root Double is long, like way too long. The narrative spends a lot of its time bringing up its sci-fi concepts and making sure to explain every little detail, which isn't necessarily bad. I am a Zero-Escape fan after all, but Root Double's execution is exhausting. The theories are brought up constantly, and every time there's new information to be added on, characters feel the need to repeat the basics of ideas in vivid detail over and over and over. It's just overkill. It isn't necessarily bad during the facility sequence, but during the flashback sections of the story, it's unbearable at times. Compounded with the confusing route system that serves to overly convolute progressing through a pretty linear narrative, you have a game that feels overly bloated with padding. And well, not a writing criticism in particular, but all the female character designs boil down to having a baby face and then slapping melons on them. Like, what are these eyes? Why are their eyes so big? Back on track. It's a shame too, because the story and characters at its core is fantastic, and how everything ties together and gets wrapped up in its true ending brought me close to tears multiple times. I just wish some of the fat could have been trimmed down so this wonderful story could fully shine. At the very least, it has me intrigued on checking out what his other works are like. The console version of Sonic Generations is easily one of my favorite games ever, and I really enjoyed most of the handheld Sonic games. I actually prefer Color's DS than its Wii counterpart. So with Generations for 3DS being as mid as it was a bit disappointing. There's nothing inherently wrong with anything, it's just a nothing burger of a game. Both Sonics control fine, the level design exists, there's speed, I guess. The stages are mostly different from the console version, but for an anniversary game, I just expected a bit more handheld representation with its stages. Both Sonics are stuck on a 2D plane, so the differences are very minuscule, especially after Classic Sonic gets the homing attack. I just feel that modern Sonic should have had stages that took advantage of the dual screen, akin to the Rush games. It's nothing much, but it's at least something different that represents the modern handheld Sonic. But yeah, there's nothing really more to say. Sonic Generations for 3DS was indeed a video game I played this year, and as someone who loves this character, I just wish so many of his games didn't leave me with this empty feeling. Hey, wait a minute. Let's just get this out of the way. Sonic Frontiers is a janky-ass video game. The open world is barren and devoid of meaningful things to do. The cyberspace stages control clunkily and are extremely short, and the reuse of previous game level designs and aesthetic themes is a bit of a letdown. The story, while interesting and much better than anything in over a decade, feels a bit undercooked. And yet, despite all the jank and lack of polish, I love Sonic Frontiers. For open world games, I value how movement works rather than the content of the world itself. So just the simple act of running around an open field, grinding on rails and bouncing on bounce pads, while admittedly a bit mindless due to its automation, I found exhilarating. It's akin to web swinging in Spider-Man games. It's just fun to move around the world, only with a bit more spazzy controls and an empty world filled with pop-in. Yeah, the game isn't exactly a looker on Switch, the platform I played on, but it gets the job done despite its rough visuals. Although, when it comes to the boss fights, the game looks great. They're large in scale and have a lot going on, but the spectacle is there and it still manages to run at a stable frame rate. And the music during these sections are easily the highlight. I don't mind the ambient piano in the overworld, or the EDM of the cyberspace stages, but the boss tracks, being the return of the overly edgy and cheesy butt rock tunes, that's Sonic to me. That's Sonic Frontiers in a nutshell. Flawed as shit, but the amount of fun I had goofing off in this game won me over in the end. Not gonna lie, I wasn't too interested in Splatoon 3 leading up to its release. I loved Splatoon 1 and 2, but 3 just seemed like Splatoon 2. Again. Which isn't a bad thing, but I didn't want to drop full price for a similar experience I could already have with the game I own. However, if there was one aspect I was interested in, that would be the single player campaign. Splatoon always has had delightfully bonkers story modes, with gameplay akin to a 3D platformer, but if you had a gun, or a paint roller, or a crab mech. Splatoon 2's DLC is easily one of my favorite single-player offerings Nintendo has ever put out, so with 3 following a similar gameplay structure, I was stoked to try it out. One discounted purchase later, and yep, the campaign owns. It starts out as standard stuff, completing fun and varied objectives, but the real meat lies later in the game, as the challenges become more elaborate and the story becomes more incomprehensible. Splatoon has always had batshit insane finales, but 3 easily takes the cake by having the most bonkers finale of them all. It had me grinning ear to ear the entire time. As for the multiplayer, it sure is Splatoon, so it's pretty good with some neat tweaks and quality of life features, but nothing new enough for me to keep coming back to it. At least until the DLC expansion for 3 comes out. Usually when people talk about Spider-Man games, they tend to be referring to the big console versions. After all, they're the main versions and what most people have played. Recently though, I've been trying to play more of the DS Spider-Man games, trying to see if there were gems hidden behind their console big brothers, or games better left forgotten. This year I played through Web of Shadows for DS. The main gist of the symbiotes taking over and having Spidey utilize 2 different suits to fight is still here, but this rendition is a very light Metroidvania, with the choice system for the story being gutted entirely. What we're left with is a game with solid exploration and combat. Nothing groundbreaking, but still a fun time regardless, especially if you're a Spider-Man fan. The best part of Web of Shadows DS, I'd say, isn't the actual game itself, but what it would inform for Kryptonite's next whip at a Spider-Man game. Shattered Dimensions DS expands on the exploration of this game, and fine-tunes the combat to create what I'd argue is one of the best combat systems in any Spider-Man game ever. So yeah, overall Web of Shadows isn't anything outstanding on its own, but still a good time. Certainly better than the previous symbiote Spider-Man game.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
This game could have been alright. Not good, but not bad. I really enjoyed Vicarious Vision's previous Spider-Man DS game, Ultimate Spider-Man, but 3 decides to tack on unnecessary touchscreen controls, and yikes, it's bad. I wouldn't say portable Spidey games pre-Web of Shadows had great combat, but it was functional and amusing to slap a thug with chunky sprites. This is just unresponsive swiping. Holding the DS this way is also very uncomfortable for long periods of time. There's also a quote-unquote open world they promoted on the back of the box. It's just different 2D districts of New York you can fight crimes in, fitted with their own city health meter. It's neat, I guess, if pretty bare bones. Why are there touchscreen controls? What else? Switching suits makes you stronger? Cool? Not as neat as changing moves like in Web of Shadows DS or playing as Venom in Ultimate Spider-Man. Goddamn touchscreen controls. For almost a decade, I've struggled to get into the first Xenoblade game. On multiple occasions, I tried to push through, only to quit around the first tutorial battle with Shulk. And then I played 2 when it came out, and despite its glaring issues in gameplay and writing, I loved my time with it. And then I tried out 1 again, and nah, I stopped at the exact same spot. But with the release of Xenoblade 3 tying the worlds of 1 and 2 together, I decided now was the time to push through. And that bored feeling I felt at the beginning permeated through the rest of the game. If 2's combat was way too overly complex, then 1's combat is way too overly mundane. The lack of timing actions to visuals and QTEs meant I checked out quite often. The world is visually stunning and interesting to explore, but movement is so sluggish. This impacts the dungeons and interior locations immensely, compounded with sonic forces like level design, and you'll constantly be pressing autorun and watching the characters go about a hallway with a casual stroll. The 2 things I would hope carry the game for me would be the stories and characters, and for the first 2/3, it's a bit of a slog. I found so much of it to go between being a bore or so bad it's funny. There were numerous occasions I burst out laughing at some of the things going on, taking itself too seriously. As for the characters, they exist. With the exception of 1, I enjoy their personalities quite a bit, thanks to much more grounded writing in comparison to Xenoblade 2. However, the lack of development for most of the main cast meant I didn't really get invested in them as characters, nor as a group. The one exception is Melia and the protagonist Shulk, who hard carries the game. From start to finish, Shulk's journey and development is easily the most interesting and compelling part of the story. How a simple revenge narrative evolves into something grander. The last few chapters were excellent because he was in the forefront, and overall such a stellar protagonist. That's the one relief, I'd say. Xenoblade Chronicles, with its ups and downs, at least ends on a high note. As for the added epilogue, Future Connected, I actually prefer it to the main game, cause hey, I'd rather be underwhelmed for 4 hours than 40. I've never felt conflicted in any game than with Xenoblade Chronicles 3. As a game, it's solid and the first in the series where I never felt frustrated or overwhelmed by its gameplay systems. Fighting enemies and exploring the dense, beautiful world is fun, even if moving around is still pretty sluggish. However, it was the story that I was the most looking forward to, and oh dear, it's a mixed bag. For every moment that's peak fiction, there's a moment that's just as strongly terrible that follows. For every masterful component, there's a frustrating caveat that follows it. It's a game filled with astronomical highs and infuriating lows, chief of which is the protagonist Noah. Noah is easily one of my least favorite fictional characters of all time. There's wonderful setup demonstrating his convictions and beliefs, but any sort of progression for him to reach that destination is lost when his convictions are rarely challenged, with most of the characters going, "Whoa, Noah's so cool, Noah is perfect, Noah can't do anything wrong." The few times the story does challenge his ideals are either settled within 2 seconds, he never thinks about ever again, or retroactively gets reversed. The other characters fare slightly better, but are hindered by the game's abysmal narrative structure. All the wonderful setup they have in the main story is deemed unimportant enough to actually finish within the narrative, instead opting to relegate the conclusion to their arcs as optional side quests. It's so dumb. To add insult to injury, there's a handful of main quests that spotlight just random characters that have nothing to do with the story at all, but apparently the game deems these characters important enough to take away from the main cast. I don't mind the world building or fleshing out characters through these side quests. 3 already does that, and plenty of them are great, but when literal plot points at best are heavily gimped to satisfy this gameplay loop, and at worst can be missed entirely, that's really bad. It's like going to a burger place, but they only give you buns and a few ketchup packets. You actually have to find the rest of the burger yourself, and by the time it's all assembled, it's cold and soggy. There's so much to love in Xenoblade 3. The music, world, aspects of the story are phenomenal. It's just a few bad aspects, a few bad apples ruin the entire bunch for me. Looking back on 2022, a lot of the games that I ended up playing weren't these big masterful titles where everything comes together to create something mind-blowingly amazing. Most have glaring flaws or minor issues that compounded to hold them back. Despite this, what a good chunk of what these titles had was a shining aspect that allowed them to resonate, even despite their problems. And in the end, that's what matters. Games are meant to be fun, and as long as there's something that manages to resonate, even despite its flaws, then that's a win for me. With 2023 hopefully providing these masterful big hitters, it's important to, I think, at least recognize these types of games moving forward.